Hello everyone and welcome to this month's education webinar stream. So today we are going to be focusing on Substance Designer, and we are going to take a look at creating a rocky kind of ground material, kind of like a wasteland type material, kind of, thinking wasteland for the Halloween type theme to it. So yeah, what we're going to do, like I said, is jump right into Designer. I'm going to be using 2017.2, which we just recently has been released, and I think it's maybe about a week old or so. Again, another free update in the 2017 series. Hello, I'm also going to be, monitoring the live chat. So if you have questions as we go, please just let me know. Hey everyone, I see some hellos coming in on the live chat. So if you guys don't mind, just give me a quick kind of thumbs up or let me know that the audio is going okay, and then we'll just jump right here into Designer. So like I said, 2017, the main kind of focus of this is going to be taking a look at some of the new nodes that we have within 2017.2. So really taking a more specific look at the flood fill node. All right, so let me just switch over here to my capture view. All right, so we're now looking at the Substance Designer screen. Thanks a lot, everybody, for the audio okay notice. All right, so here I'm going to be working on just a little material that I've just kind of been playing with here for, different demo type and training type situations. And so this one here, like I said, rocky ground, kind of dirt. But what we're going to do is focus on how this was created, specifically using some of the new nodes within Designer 2017.2. And we're really going to focus in mainly on the flood fill node. All right, so let's jump in and start to take a look here at this material. And so the first thing that I needed to actually do for this material was come up with some kind of like stone-like pattern here. So this here is the pattern that I kind of worked up, and the way this was created was using just the tile random node here. So if I just double click at this guy, we can start to see this tile random. Now you'll notice that in my case, this one says tile random legacy because I actually had started working on this before the new nodes come in. So if you open up like any of your previous graphs of any of your other Substance Designer files before 2017.2, you'll start to notice that some nodes are going to be kind of flagged with this like legacy. That just means it's the old node. So one of the things, if we come into here and I'll just do a search for tile random, we'll add this, you'll start to see that, and I think it's this guy here. No, it actually might just be the tile generator. So in this particular case, this guy's pretty much the exact same with some of the caveat here that the new version is now going to support this non-square expansion option. So all of the nodes, minus just a few of the grunge maps at this time, are supporting non-square. The grunge maps will as well. It's just a matter of time to have those processed. So we'll see those in a future update. Okay, so starting here with this tile random, you can see, let me just close up all of these guys here. So I started with the tile random just to give me some shapes like you see here. Some of these just kind of oval shapes, and some of them have their luminance changed. So for example, you'll see here for the pattern, it's just set to disk. So that's how we get a disk. And then just kind of going through here and just changing some of these properties just to get some kind of random, kind of just this random distribution like you see here. Now, if we scroll down here to color, you'll notice that color random is set all the way to 1, so we get some of this luminance variation within this grayscale. Now, the whole goal is to take, when you have a pattern or a shape kind of like this, you can use the distance node. So let me just create an instance here of the distance node. You can take the distance node and plug that in as a source input here. And you've got two options for combine and source. We'll switch this to only source. Now you'll notice that as I start to increase my maximum distance here, nothing is happening. And that's because we need to have an actual mask here, a binary mask for this, which we don't have. So to create something like that, what I'll do here is just run a levels and then just kind of clamp all of my values to pure white like this. Now the reason why I don't have it here is because I need to have this luminance variation. So now we're going to have this levels as a mask. We'll plug this in, and then with distance, we can get something that looks like this. So we're basically going to take this shape that we have, and we're going to just kind of push it out on the borders until everything just kind of starts to meet and just, just kind of weld together, basically. So that's how you can create a pattern like this, which is like a Voronoi pattern. So something that's pretty common in nature and that you'll use a lot in some of your shapes. So this is a way to create this. Now, we also have a generator for this already. So let's see. If I come over to, let's see, my noises. Yeah, I think it's just here in my noises. It's the cell patterns here. So let me just do a search. Do cell. And so here you can see, I'll bring cell 4 out. We get something like this as well, and we can adjust the scale of it. And so here's kind of a difference between these two shapes here. Now you'll notice that this one is kind of like a homegrown shape, so I have a little bit more control, however, how this guy is created versus this one, where I really only have control over, like, say, this disorder and the scale of it. But here you'll notice that this is much more kind of angular shapes, and this one I get a little bit slight curves and things like that. And that's because my base shape, again, going all the way back to this tile random, was based on that disc pattern. So that's why I'm kind of going through the trouble to create that. So we get our distance, and then from there it's just a simple matter of an edge detect. And now we kind of get this kind of stone, kind of like these little stone plates here, I guess we'll call it. And then from here, I just used a warp to start to kind of warp these edges like this. And it's just using a new Perlin noise. You'll also notice here that our Perlin noise, because it's the new version of this, all the noises and patterns are going to have this scale option here so that we can just adjust the scale of this. So just changing this control here is going to just adjust the overall scale. And so here we'll, whoops, that's a little too much. So maybe something like this here. So we get a pattern like this. And here is where we're going to get into the ability, using the new flood fill, to go from, say, a shape like this all the way to something that's a 3D shape like this. And it's super powerful. So let's take a look at how this works. All right, so we'll pull these guys out. Now, when you have something like this that's like a binary shape like this, or a binary mask, basically, it's just black and white, we can then use the flood fill node. And so if we just plug this here into the flood fill, you can start to see that this gives us, just some data. One question here, how long would the stream be? We just usually make these streams about an hour. Every now and then I go over, I don't know, probably pretty much every time. But the goal here is to make sure we kind of try to stop this with about an hour. If you have to run off, no problem. These are all archived as well, so you can always come back and watch it later. Okay, so flood fill gives us this data, and then from this data here, we can use these subsequent flood fill nodes to get different types of data. So for instance, I can take this here to a flood fill to gradient. So I'll plug this in, and now this gives me the ability to go from this shape to now basically have a gradient for each one of these shapes that I have in here. And I can adjust my angle of that shape as well as a variation to kind of mix this up a bit like this. So here, we start to get the ability to have this kind of grayscale image per shape, but based off this kind of baked binary mask like this. So here, I think I've just got a little too much of this in here. So I just went back and just changed the scale of my Perlin noise. All right, so now we have this flood fill to gradient, and it gives us this gradient. One other thing about this is that if we set this angle variation here all the way to 1, we can then use our random seed just to kind of drive these different, different angle variations here instead of this controller. So here, I'm going to switch this to a value of 1, take the node, I'm just going to hit Control D just to duplicate it, and then come over here to my random seed and switch it to 2. And now I get 2 different variations here of this gradient. One other thing that's really important to understand with this gradient is here, each one of these gradients that are being kind of filled into the section of my pattern, all my shapes, it's just basically doing this for the same scale for every shape size. So for example, if we look kind of right in this area, we get 3 shapes. We have this big shape here, a medium, and a small. And if we look at the overall gradient, going from, say, dark to light, dark to light and dark to light, it's the same scale. The same kind of white value is the same on this very small versus on this large. And when we look at this like it's a height map, that's not really going to give us it's not going to produce for us the height range that we want in a more realistic way. So, for example, we're saying that this height area for this big, large rock is going to be the exact same value as this smaller rock. So if we want to redistribute this gradient value range so that it equates to the actual size of these patterns, we can use this bounding box size here to do that. So multiply by bounding box. And notice that if I set this all the way to 1, we now get a new redistribution of this gradient based on the actual size of these patterns. So here you'll notice that the smallest pattern, its highest point or its widest area here, it's darker than this larger rock here, where we're going to have in our height map, we're looking at this slope. This is kind of the highest area due to this kind of more white value versus the dark. So it just basically skews the gradient so that, like I said, it adheres to the overall actual shape of these sizes. And we'll use this to our advantage here in a little bit. So for now, let's just set that to 1. Let's come over to this guy and we'll change a little bit of its bounding box size as well. So now we have these two different shapes here. And if we blend these guys together like this, so we'll blend our foreground and our background, and then I'll come into my blending mode and set it to a min or darken, you'll start to see that we're able to begin this process of kind of building up these kind of 3D shapes. And I really like this technique because it helps me to, really start to introduce some planes here to these shapes. And I have control over that as well. So for example, let's go back to this second flood fill where I have this bounding box size. As I start to change this, you'll notice that now it's like I'm taking this slope and I'm completely able to change and redistribute that slope. So here you can see that maybe using the slider, we concentrate more of a slope here, and then we have another, almost like a, I don't know, it could be like a 90-degree cut angle here, and then we slope down this way. Almost like using like a trim, some kind of like trim dynamic brush or operation here to create these planes. So now what we'll do, we'll just select these two nodes and we'll duplicate these guys. And we'll just start to kind of chain a network together here. So on this one, we'll switch the random seed value to a 3. So here we had 1, 2, and 3, automatically varying this for us. And now you can see that once we start to blend into this third option or this third shape here with our min darken, we get another plane, which of course I can go into my bounding box size slider and start to adjust it. So maybe I'll try to create a plane or this kind of slope here. So now I have 3 different planes to this. And then it becomes a matter of, let's select these two guys. Let's just duplicate them, bring this over, and do the same thing. Now this time, again, we need to come back to our random seed and switch this value. So now we get another plane into here. And of course, go back to our bounding box, and we can start to, change this slope angle just by making, adjustment to the slider. So now I'm starting to get, a much more kind of 3D shape here to what I'm doing here with these rocks. And like I said, my favorite part of this is that I have this control now to be able to adjust these planes based on this bounding box size attribute. So now I'm getting like these types of 3D shapes, all of that coming from this binary mass shape that I created. So we never had the capability to do something like this before in Designer, and this really opens up a lot of possibilities. What I'm showing here, this just being one possibility. So like I said, you'll find many, many uses for this. So I use this same technique here, and if I just go all the way back, this is kind of the shape that I use for these rocks. This is what we're going to end up with here. So after this, ran a levels on it just to make some adjustments. Another thing that we could do here is just run an auto levels. So I'll plug this in, and you can see that it just kind of redistributes this range to give me this kind of auto levels result. And then from here, I start to, if I want to look at this as more like kind of like my first kind of level of this shaping process, where this is kind of like my large shapes, I then go into another process where I'm going to start to create some more smaller details by using this slope blur. So here, I choose a slope blur with a Perlin noise. I use purlin noise a lot when it comes to like shaping rocks. So here's what we had before. You can see that our plane here, if we look at this guy in particular, very hard kind of angular planes here. This gives us the foundation, and now we're going to break this up with slope blur to produce something more like this. So it's just kind of rounding some of these edges. Here's another plane that gets introduced for us. So we didn't have that before, and slope blur is able to produce this for us. Now with what I'm doing here is I'm setting my samples to 32 and setting my mode here to min. And what min does is it takes kind of this black area that you have and pushes it towards the white. So that's how we're producing kind of this blurred slope here. And then here, if we check it with just the auto levels, we get kind of this result. So it's not as intense here. But in my case, instead of just using auto levels, I wanted to kind of, tweak that a little bit more. So I used more of a manual process here. Here's my input white, and you can see that I've just, reworked kind of that value range there. All right, so now this is the kind of shapes that I'm getting here with my rocks just by using my flood fill and my slope blur. So we went from this single shape, this mask, all the way to this more 3D version of that just by using flood fill, levels, and slope blur. Okay, so once I get something like that, kind of the next stage is to start adding more details to kind of cut into these rocks like this. So you'll notice here, what I'm doing is I'm taking my shape here. This is just my kind of my mask shape. And then what I do is I run another slope blur on this using a purlin noise. So if we look at this guy, it's a purlin noise. So another question that just came in here, can the flood fill be used to create a random mask or random grayscale values? Absolutely. So to show, and I actually do that in here. I usually do that when I get to kind of my color stage, but just to give you an idea, this was just one of the nodes, so that was to gradient. So another option here is to go to flood fill. You have random color, which we're going to use in just a little bit, but here is random grayscale. So let's take a look. And now we get that random grayscale. So just again from that single flood fill gradient, that flood fill node, which provides us with the positional information we need, we can then derive, like I said, random colors. No parameters to this, it's just random colors. While we're here and we're talking about this, another technique I'd like to show you, if you're wanting to work with kind of these random grayscale values, if we do flood fill to random color, so like I said, we're going to use this node a little bit later. Then what I do is I'll use the RGB, let's see here, RGBA split, plug this guy into here, and now if I look at my red, I get this version, this variation. If I look at my green, I get a different variation, and then if I look at my blue, I get another variation. So this, using this method here, is a way for me to get these random gradient, constant colors, but have like 3 different variations instead of just using the single node. So there's another use of these. Again, we'll cover some of this stuff a little bit later. Okay, so here we start to get kind of this slope blur. And then what I do is I slope blur this again, except this time my purlin noise, just using an increased scale. So we get smaller shapes. Then I do a a slope blur with another version and even more kind of intense scale, I think. Here, let me check the scale on these guys. Okay, no, this one here is 24, so it's a little larger. And then this one here is even smaller. So I get these 2 variations here, and then I blend them together with an add. So this gives me this kind of edge work that I'm doing here. So notice that here in the middle, it's completely flat white, like a plateau. And then here I've got just basically the edges. And then what I like to do is take my 3D shape result that I had before, and then this new edge that I just created here with those slope blurs, and then blend these 2 guys together. I do a multiply, and then just kind of adjust my opacity to get the shape I want. So here's where I'm getting some of this edge work here on the rock, but then not really affecting this height information that I have coming in from the original kind of working of those 3D shapes. So we get something like this. Okay, so from here, what I'm going to do is start to work on, and here, just so we can get a better idea of what we're doing here, let's look at this in the 3D view. So I'm going to just quickly create a base material. Let's switch this guy to dielectric, and we'll just increase our roughness value. Here I'm going to input a normal map, so it gives me a little normal input. And let's create a normal. Plug this guy into here. And let's take the result of what we had just created and plug that here into our normal. So now I'll just right click, drag and drop this here into my 3D view. And then I'll come back here to this normal and I'll set it to something really high so we can kind of see this. All right, we'll move this around, just my light around. Would this apply to an icy material? Yeah, I think so. I think, yeah, you'll find there's lots of uses for different ways you can work with this flood fill. Okay, so here's kind of what we're creating right here, and you see kind of the basics, the basic kind of shapes for these rocks here, these stones. Okay, so let me move these guys down towards this way. Now, the next thing I want to do is some of these kind of top areas, the like kind of the high areas of my height map. I want to start to introduce some kind of damage to these areas. So one way to do that, here you can see I've got my shape. I just run a levels so that I could basically isolate kind of the top area here of this height map. We have a new levels node as well that we can use. Not levels, I'm sorry. It's a histogram select. So if I grab the histogram select node, what this guy allows me to do is adjust my position. So this basically like allows me to just select areas of a height map. So I could do something like this to get a similar effect as to what I'm getting here with just my levels. So this gives me kind of like a control here where I can just kind of almost like scan through and select regions in a height map. So that's another new kind of node that you could use for that. In my case, I just used the levels to kind of isolate it. Then I used the Perlin noise again to drive that through a slope blur just to break this shape up. So here's the broken up shape. Here's what I had before, and then just introduced a little bit of distortion here using a slope blur. Then I take like a clouds noise because of the kind of pattern that I'm getting in here, and then subtract it by my shape. So now I'm getting a lot of noise kind of like in this area here, which is going to be here, you know, the kind of the top levels of where those rocks are going to be. And then it's a matter of taking that and just integrating that back down here. So you can see I'm just subtracting that in. Now, there's some cracks here that I'm working with. I'm going to show you that in just a moment. But for now, let's take a look at the result of what we had here. So let's take, well, that was 125. I meant to just do 20. Let me make sure that's right. There we go. So that was way too intense. All right, so let's take this guy and throw him here into our levels. And then here you can see that what that did, it just added some kind of damage, and it's isolated or selected to the, you know, where that kind of top part of that height is. You'll also notice that here is where I'm starting to integrate in some of these cracks. So I want to show you kind of some techniques for that. So here, I'm using this distance node again to create a pattern. It starts off with just using the tile random here, set to square, just to get me some patterns, and then use distance. This time, instead of a mask, I use the mask input and the source input, both being this tile generator, to produce this effect. Set to only source, and now if we look, we start to get kind of these lines like this. So this kind of dips down, and we get some of these lines. And we're going to use that, so you'll notice if we run this into edge detect, now we start to get something that we can work with in terms of crack lines. Again, we could use something like maybe cells 2 to get a kind of a default, and then we can adjust our edge width and so on. So you can get something like this, but you can see this one is a little bit more organic because of the way my input shapes using this distance and what I'm trying to create here. By using the square, you can see how it's giving me like angles like this and this, which produce things, you can see it here, these little these little cut-in shapes and so on, versus getting something more like this where we're not getting cut shapes like that. All right, so we'll remove that. Okay, so then what I'm going to do is start to slope blur this. So first thing is I blur it and then slope blur it back by its original shape. And what that does is give me, if I zoom in really close, you can see this gives me like a really kind of tight kind of edge here with a nice little kind of gradient kind of bevel out this way. And so we're going to use that shape here when we use our slope blur with something really noisy like this black and white spots. And this is going to help us produce these types of crack shapes here. So that's what we're getting after we do that slope blur operation. And then just run a levels on it just to kind of redistribute those values. So here's where our cracks are coming from. Now the next thing is to take this shape here, which is our original directional, our distance, and we're going to slope blur that here by our blur again, so we get just a little bit of distortion on this guy. And we're going to use this mask here. Notice that now we're going to think of this like a height. So we've got like, okay, this big kind of white area here is going to be higher on our height map, and then we've got like a darker, just variance on height levels. And what we're going to do is we're going to use this to help us push kind of cracked, broken off pieces of our rock. Like some of that's going to be higher and some of it's going to be lower and so on. So to do that, like I said, we last left off here with this levels for our crack. And then we're just going to integrate these two pieces down. So now you can see where this crack is coming. This piece is going to be higher than, say, this piece. Because if we look at these two, grayscale ranges, this white's going to be higher than this grayer piece here in the height map. Now, right now we have these cracks and they're working, but they're still pretty kind of uniform. It's just like this nice little line like this. It's still, it has a slight curve to it here and there in some of these areas, but it's still a little too clean. So this right here is a good technique to help break this up. So you can use something like this crystals. And here it's just using a transform here just to adjust some tiling to it, which now what I could have done is on the crystal node. So if we did crystals like this, we can adjust the scale on it without having to have that extra node. Here I just had the node. Okay, so now we have this, and we're going to do a directional warp. And what that's doing, directional warp, well, here, let's do it like this. We have a directional warp node with the input coming in to be this, and we're going to use this crystals as the intensity, and we change the warp angle to just kind of a off in an angle like this. And if I just really start to adjust here my intensity a little bit more, now you can see what this is producing because of all these different variances in these shapes. Like this right here, if you look kind of, this is like dark, and then we've got this line, and then there's a complete change in slope values and all that. And what that does is produce for us kind of crack lines that we have a dip, straight up, kind of, the line becomes more jagged instead of it being just perfectly smooth like this. So here is the result before, it's perfectly smooth. Here's the result after. Again, starts to look a little bit more like kind of like a crack. Okay, so now I'm going to show you a technique here. So what you could do before is if we take like a shape like this and we overlay this. So let's just show it. Let's take this this directional blend here, and let's see. Oh, I'm sorry. Let's pull this guy into here. This was our original kind of height shape before we actually add these cracks. So if we do something like this, and I switch it to multiply, so now you can see this is the height map here. If you notice, if we just left it as is here, you get like these crack lines. It's like they almost follow, they essentially follow this exact same fault line. Here you can see this is two different rock shapes, but this crack line pattern here is following this perfect fault line all the way across. Now, here is that white shape, like in our height map. See, this is higher than this area here. And that piece as well just completely matches up with, this rock that's next to it. Looks pretty terrible. So what we want to do with this is we want to be able to offset this in some way. And I'm going to show you two different techniques to do this. This is kind of like the Frankenstein technique, basically, because you can see it looks like, we're just taking different pieces and kind of patchworking them together here. So first thing I'm going to do, use my flood fill because of my shape that I had, my original shape way back here. All we have is this binary shape. So before 2017.2, we would have been kind of stuck in a hard space, basically. But now we can use flood fill here to derive for us this flood fill to random color. And then here you can see that what I did was I just used a grayscale conversion of this to get something like this. Again, instead of doing it this way, and this way gives me a different result. Here, let me show you what I mean here. Let's do flood fill, and let's do random grayscale. This one right here is to the random color. So what I want to do is just borrow out my original flood fill. So let's grab this connection and plug it into here. So now I get this grayscale value. But here, underneath grayscale conversion, you can see that it's the same thing, just not nearly as intense. So just a different variation of this as well, because I'm able to come in here and mess around with my channel weights. So for example, I could get something more like, I could get another kind of randomized version of this just by changing these channel weights around versus what I'm getting here. So again, just another technique to kind of vary that. So here you can see that this guy becomes the intensity input to a directional warp. And what the directional warp does, see, if we put everything back to 0 and we start to warp this, it's just pushing all of these shapes, warping them directionally with whatever angle. So it's really just, it's one directional offset is what we have. And here's the offset angle, which is denoted by this warp angle. So now let's look at what this is doing. So here's what we had without the directional warp. Here's what we have with the directional warp. So now it just offsets this. And if we go back to this directional warp, if I change my angle, you can see I'm just offsetting this entire shape. All of this input here. And the intensity value can help, drive this. So here you can see what we're doing. This is a good example. Here's the shape that's lining up perfect. And as I start to move this, it's pushing this piece because this value is different than this value. So white means it's going to move more. So that shape here is going to offset it more in the direction that we choose, that warp angle, more than it is this grayer shape. And that's precisely what we're getting here. So we'll come back and adjust our intensity. And now we get something like this. So this allows us to kind of break up and offset these shapes. This technique works very well, use a lot. And it's not an expensive technique to use. However, there's another way to do this, which gives you a more randomized look, because we're going to actually offset all of these, this entire pattern here. Let's see, this entire pattern, we're going to put each one of these pieces differently into each one of these shape areas, because we can do that with vector data. So here's a way we can do that. Here you can see that I'm using the flood fill to random color. So this gives me a bunch of different random colors. And I can plug this into our vector warp. So this is a new node as well. We had vector morph. Now we have vector warp grayscale. So I can take my input here. Whoops, let's grab this guy. Take my input into this. Here, let's fix that. And now I need a vector, and that vector is just going to be our random color. So we'll plug that into the vector map, and I'll double click, and you can see that that's just automatically offsetting everything based on that vector. So now what we'd get, let's take the result of this guy and plug it in. Same kind of effect. It's just completely broken up, even more random versus what we had with this result. Let's see. Whoops. I'm sorry, I had that hooked in there wrong. So that's our vector warp. Let's see. Got this plugged in wrong. Hold on just a second. Let's plug this guy into here, and then we want to get this guy into the background. There we go. All right. So now this is the offset we get. It's much, much more varied. So here we have this versus the directional warp. The directional warp, again, like I said, gives us some control. We can change the angle and so on to kind of how we want to warp this guy. But again, it's only warping based on one direction, whereas with the vector warp, we're actually going to be able to do this with multi-directional because of the vector angles. So now we just integrate our cracks in, and that's how we're getting these crack shapes. One other thing I did was just use something like a clouds and just kind of blended this guy here just to get a little bit of kind of rough detail into that. So what I'm showing at this stage, again, is multiple uses here of this flood fill. First thing, flood fill to generate kind of 3D shapes. Again, another version of the flood fill to produce a random color that I can then use as a vector map input to warp and offset other patterns like cracks and things that I'm overlaying my rock shapes. Also, you can see that I was able to use the same random color converted to grayscale, so I can adjust my channel weight values to get different luminance variances here in grayscale. Or there's an actual specific node for this, flood fill to random grayscale. So a lot of different uses there for those nodes. Okay, so that takes us basically all the way down to what we have here, which is just kind of our basic kind of rock shape. Now, the next thing I kind of want to show you is when I started to add, here, let's take the full view into here, is when I started to actually add a lot of these kind of rock shapes here and scatter them. And so that's going to start to introduce another node. It's the tile sampler, which isn't new, but it's greatly been improved. And you can see here with the tile sampler, let's just do this from scratch. So I'm going to create the tile sampler here. And the tile sampler, very powerful node, allows us to create a tile here. But what makes it different than things like tile generator or tile random is that we have these input maps like displacement, rotation, vector. And what this does is it allows us to take maps as input to multiply them over different parameters. So you'll see us use that in a little bit when we use a scale map input or a mask input here. So to start, the tile sampler allows us, if we switch this to a pattern input, we can then start to choose multiple pattern types or pattern inputs, so we can vary this. So for example, I have a subgraph here, which I'll talk about in a minute, that creates a stone like you see here. And this graph, I have some controls. So just by changing the controls, I'm able to change the shape of the rock. Same thing here, and same thing here. And now I'm going to use these guys. So if we just plug these into pattern input 1, 2, and 3, put him up here at 3. I can distribute this pattern here. Let's take this all the way down to like an 8x8 so we can see it. So now what I have is my pattern input based on a random distribution of each one of these different pattern inputs. So it's just randomly taking each of my pattern inputs and just using those to create the tile. And then from here, it's a matter of going in and say, okay, let's adjust our size. Here you can see I'm getting just different shapes. We'll do a scale random. We'll come in here to our position. We'll position random this. So now we're getting this kind of scattering and offset and so on. And then here we'll come down to our rotation, do a random rotation. And, just keep building this effect up, but it just becomes more varied because we're able to use these multiple pattern inputs now. And so that's how I kind of came to this type of solution. Now, you'll also notice here that I'm starting to get kind of like a collection of these rocks in certain areas. And that's because I'm doing a couple different things. Number one, let's take a look at our scale map input. So here, let's just start to increase this to like a 12 by 12. So it's kind of large so we can see it. And I can use an input map to drive the scale. So right now, we're using this random scale, but below it, we have a map multiplier. So what I did here was I took a Perlin noise and just ran a levels on it to get, just this type of remap to those grayscale ranges. And then I'm going to plug this into the scale map input. So now let's look at the result. If I come over to this map multiplier and I start to, multiply this, the stones they're changing their scale based on that scale map. Also, I still have control over this scale map random. So I can randomize it, adjust my scale, but then have the scale map further, change what the scale is going to be, where, white value is going to be smaller stones and so on. So now I've got a little bit extra variation to that. Another thing that I can do is use a mask here to help drive where these stones are going to be. So again, let's set this up to a much larger value so we can really see this when we mask it. So what I did here was use the histogram select. So we talked a little bit about that earlier. Here's my height map, and I use the histogram select to select this range here in my height. And then I'm going to feed that. So let me just borrow this connection out here. And I'm going to feed that, we'll zoom in, into my mask input. So here's what we have with our rocks. If we scale down here towards where we have our color section, there's this mask map threshold. And I start to increase this just even a little bit. It's now masking based on my mask input. And just by simply changing, if we come over into here, this is my original. If I go back to this histogram select and we start to change its position value, I can start to adjust, where these rocks are going to start showing up and things. Here you can see them in the 3D view where they're just being repositioned. So Tile Sampler is pretty powerful. This ability to change these input patterns to multiple pattern numbers, we've added that to Tile Sampler, Tile Random, Tile Generator, Splatter Circle. So all of these kind of like tiling, replicating nodes, you can have multiple pattern inputs to that. Okay, so another thing that I kind of want to show with this that's kind of interesting and what I started to kind of work on was how to build up these little stones that I have here. So if we look, we have these little stone shapes. How can we build this up? So I'm going to come over into this stone creator. This is one version. Let's look at stone small to see a different version. So here, I don't need these nodes. So what I do in this case is I start here with just a basic shape. This one here is set to half bell. Warp it based on a purlin noise, so it's very slight, little warp here. And then I just kind of blend that back by itself to kind of cut that shape down. And then a little slope blur with the purlin noise to get a shape like this. Then I run a levels on it to get this. So this is kind of giving me my overall kind of rounded outline shape of what I want maybe one of these stones to be. Then I run a levels on it again to create my mask. Now from here, what I did was I did a flood fill into this, and then I did the same trick as before. Flood fill to gradient, angle variation all the way up to 1, and then work on this bounding box size. And I'm going to use the random seed to change this angle. So random seed, this one's at 0, 1, 2, and 3. And we blend all these guys together. Now I get a little 3D shape here. Here I ran it through an auto levels just to kind of redistribute my ranges. And then I just go through and start kind of adding, my edge work and stuff. So here you can see I did that same technique that I described earlier where I slope blurred a purlin noise with a low scale and slope blurred a purlin noise with a higher scale. Actually, I'm sorry, I always get this wrong. That one's this guy's this one. Here, let's increase that a little bit like this. Okay, so now we go in and I add these two guys together and I get a shape like this. So I can make adjustments to this as well. So here, maybe we'll do this one. Okay, that's a little bit better. So it's kind of smaller. It's just like a blend of the two slope blur shapes. And then here's kind of what I'm getting on my rock. And then a slope blur with this purlin noise just to add a little bit extra detail. And then I output this. So I'm not really super happy with this. It was just kind of a quick trick. So now I'm going to show you another variation of that. But one thing that's interesting about this is in order to get my shape variation, what I did was I just came back here to this shape and exposed this pattern specific option. So now if I go back to what I had with my stone floor here, and let's take my stone small and we'll just make an instance of it into here, you can see that as I start to change the rock shape, I'm just getting a bunch of variation really quickly on these rocks. And then I have this rock trim that I can use to kind of trim the rock in like this. And again, change my shape variation. So now I can get this shape instead of in this shape, just getting different shapes that I can feed into my tile sampler really quickly. For the trim, let me show you how that was. It's super simple. All it is here on the shape. Let's see, where is that guy? It is Here's a case where I'm trying to think of where I exposed that. It may have been somewhere else. I can't really think of it. Here I've got rock shape and trim. So what I'm going to do is just come up to the top of my toolbar, hit my little eyeglass icon here, go to using custom parameters, and I'm going to choose trim. And it's going to highlight the node. And yeah, I knew it was here on this rock shape. I think that's going to be what my pattern specific was, actually. Yeah. Sorry about that. Here, if we do a shape, and we set this to be that half bell. Where is it here? Got this, oh, I'm sorry, not waves. We want half bell. If you use pattern specific, you can see where it's giving me this kind of trim value here. And we could do things like expose like rotations to get different, parameters and so on. So let's see where my rock shape is. Ah, yeah, that's on the Perlin noise. Just the disorder setting. Disorder. And what I did here was I just copy and pasted this Perlin noise so that disorder parameter is controlling both of these, and then they have a variation on their scale. So that's what's happening there. Okay, so that's how I kind of created that. But now I want to show you another version of this that I'm kind of working on that might be even better in the future. So here I'm coming up with this shape here for like a rock. And what this guy's doing is it starts with like a gradient, and I'm getting these little cutter shapes here, these little cutter tools like this. And all these are just taking the gradient and transforming it with the tiling set to no tiling. And then we take just one of our basic shapes here, and then we can just take that and use min darken. So it's kind of the same principle as what the flood fill's doing. We're using this is like almost like doing the multiply by the bounding box size, and we're using that to kind of trim in to get, these different shapes. But the reason why I kind of like this one, or what I'm kind of working on with this guy, and then it's a matter of just slope blurring with a bunch of different noises. And what it is, you'll notice, is it's a larger, then a smaller, and then really fine, like even smaller detail. So it's always worked from large shapes all the way to small. And we're just slope blurring this as we go. So first stage, second stage, third stage, so a little bit more detail in here, and then the final stage we get even more detail in here, but it's a lot smaller as we run a levels, and then I got an auto levels here to send everything to the output. Okay, so what is this doing for me? Well, first off, what I wanted to be able to do was expose these transforms here, because watch what I can do with this. If I'm in here and I just grab a transform, I can move this transform around like this and interactively like rotate and adjust it to get different rock shapes, like my trim angle, like this. Can even, grab the side and shrink it in like this and just get different stuff. So I can do this. Here's another thing. Using the histogram from this control, I could also expose these kind of values as well. So now I get something, even more, user-friendly to kind of play around with and tweak. So I haven't actually exposed these yet, but I'd like to do is show you how to do it right now so that, when you make a substance like this, when I instance this into a graph, I'm going to have a little controller here in the 2D view. So let's check this out. All you have to do, and it's not very straightforward, so that's why I want to show it here. Here's my first transform 2D node. So underneath this transform matrix, what I'm going to do is just come over here and expose this guy. And whoops, I've got a couple names already. Let's just delete these so it's all done from scratch. So let's come over to this guy, and we're going to expose this transform matrix on this first transform. You can see it says matrix 22. That's fine for now. Then let's come over and expose the offset. So we'll expose this, and it says offset. That's fine for now. So now let's double click to get to our root level, and I need to name this. So you have to have this matrix 22 as a suffix. So what I'm going to do is just call this trim 01 and then underscore matrix 22. So that'll work. Then I can go back to my offset, and I'll come into here and call this trim underscore 01 underscore offset. So that's going to work. Now, let's go to this second transform node, and let's expose this guy. So we'll do expose. This time, I'm just going to actually do a new into here and just do it right in this section. So we'll do trim underscore, 02 underscore matrix 22. And then we want to do the same thing with our offset. So expose, new, and this is our trim 02 underscore offset. Okay, so we've just done 2 for this case. That's going to be fine. So let's see what this gives us. So now let me save, and then we'll go back to our stone floor. And let's see. Let's output what we have like into here so we can see this. And now let's do this. Let's see. Let's get rid of these nodes. And let's come over to our little stone creator and drag and drop that here into our graph. So when I select this guy, we start to get some of these instance parameters. We're not going to tweak anything over here. But now I get this, because I've exposed 2 transforms or more than one. So if I did 3 or 4, they're all going to show up here. Get this nice little drop down. And I could say, okay, I want to go and work with the first trim. And now I've got this little interactive widget here to create like a variation here. So I can come in and just rotate, move this guy around. Just get some different shapes in here. However, I can work with this. And like I said, I'm also going to expose, different values. So let's try like, okay, there's a rock shape. So now we've got this one, and we'll plug it into our offset. Here in our graph, that rock is showing up here. Okay, cool. So now let's duplicate this guy so we get a different rock shape. Let's come into this one, and let's go to trim 2. Now I'm going to make a tweak with this one, and here's trim 2, just interactively adjusting my trim like this. Let's get something like this. Let's go back to trim 1, play around. Maybe that shape. So now there's rock 2. So I've got this pattern, and then I have this pattern. And let's plug that into the second pattern input. And so now that updates. Kind of hard to see where that guy went. So here, let's do it again. Let's duplicate it. Go back in. Whoops. Just make a little adjustment here. Let's go to the second trim. Here, I'm going to rotate this guy maybe all the way over into here. There we go. Let's do that. And then cut him into here. Take trim 2. Whoops. Let's try cutting him this way. Something like that, maybe. All right, so let's take that guy and plug him into pattern 3. And now he shows up over here and gives me this shape. Of course, I can always go in and start to tweak this, and it's going to update. So you can see the rocks updating here. Here it is. And here it is here. So just another way to kind of create like an interactive kind of rock kind of generator system. The other thing I'm kind of playing with for this guy is being able to, if I go back, being able to output for myself. So this is the view we have, but we'd also like to have this view so it shows me what the cutter is doing when I adjust it. So for example, this was like the first cutter shape. So as I start to kind of rotate this shape, I can see, okay, the plane that's actually used to cut. So basically that's what I want to do with this. So you can see if I start to move this plane, that's what it's doing. And then I also need to expose like these histogram controls here. So here, like if we increased our contrast and so on and so on. Yeah, so one question, had no idea. Yeah, it's an awesome control. It's very cool to be able to do this, but yeah, it's not something that's real, obvious on how you do that, but it's cool to be able to create controls like this. So what I want to do is be able to output maybe this as like kind of a debug, so I can really help to see what it is my little widget's doing there for my transform. So yeah, that's what I'm kind of working on here with this to create the stones. Again, the main takeaway from that is how it's being fed here. If we look at it again, how it's being fed into the tile sampler, as you see here, so that we can get, this spread across, all these rocks spread into these different, these different arrangements and things like that. And all these different variation we can get, because now, like I said, we can do these random pattern inputs like this. So here's what we have in this stage. Another thing that I kind of do with this is I just built up a simple kind of like dirt here. It's using the same kind of technique, using rocks, bringing these guys into here. But the way that I kind of start to blend everything up is I use here the height blend nodes. So I start kind of with like I use 2 different height blends in this case. So the first one being the bottom, in my case here, is going to be where the rocks are, and then the top height is going to be this dirt. And here I have a mask to kind of blend these two guys together to get this effect. And then I can come into here and I can adjust the height offset to get, you know, if I zoom in here on where my dirt's going to be, we can start to change this. So if we wanted to increase the contrast on it, you can see it kind of takes away some of this feathering that we're getting. And then here, maybe adjust our height. And we can get something more like this here. Let's move our light around, something like that. The other thing with this is then once that's in place, I use the result of this height blend as my base, and then I go to the height top where I just have these rocks, and now that's getting blended down over top of everything here. And then I can use my height offset to control kind of the depth of these. So like by default, if it's really high, you can see where it's just kind of obliterating, you know, some of you know, the difference in these blends here. But what I'm going to do is just adjust it like this, and we can get something here. So it's just a way to kind of blend these guys together here. And then we can also do adjustment over the priority mode, whether we want the bottom height priority or we want a balanced height map output. So you can get your balanced height, and you can also get a mask here for that blend operation. So this could be useful later if I need to use a mask just to isolate, you know, these rocks here for, you know, for these rocks here for maybe a mask for color inputs and so on. Okay, so finally, once I actually have my map, it just comes down to, you know, creating my normal, extrapolating my ambient occlusion here using the horizon-based ambient occlusion, and then here for my height, you can see I'm doing something a little different. So this here is my the height that I'm using for my normal, and this one here is the height that I'm using when I'm using displacement here. And you can see I just wanted to tone down the rocks. So for example, if I use this height, they're just really you can see the displacement they're getting because their value is too intense. So for that height map, what I do is I just used another version that just tones down their height. So now I'm getting this. And I also need to do that here for the dirt, because if I zoom in really close, this little dirt pebbles here are just, they're too much. So I need to kind of fix that as well. And then finally, I always output everything here to a base material. So this gives me kind of my, like I kind of always like to preach about, this kind of gives me my first material where I have things like my height, AO, normal, and so on, and then I work on my roughness. Once I have all those core maps together, then it becomes a matter of just layering in my color. That then gives me a full material that I can then blend with other materials. Like if I want to add like a water or mud or moss, dirt, whatever I want to add to help blend in on top of this material, all of these atomic nodes that we've been working on all get compiled down into this single mode that I use for material blending. Another thing that I kind of do when it comes to creating my height is, my roughness, is because, you know, our roughness is going to basically represent our micro surface of our material, but we've been going through a lot of trouble to create a really nice detailed height map. Once you, like I said, once you have that, the map extraction phase really simplifies everything. And with that, I'll usually take something like maybe my ambient occlusion and use that as a base. So then here I might do like an invert grayscale. Whoops, not an input. Let's delete that guy. Invert grayscale. Plug this guy into here. Now this ambient occlusion node never likes me to connect things to it when I'm in standard mode. So what I do is I hit 1 on the keyboard just to jump into standard mode, and then I can always make that connection. So now I get something like this, and then I'll run it through a histogram range. And here I get a pretty good start to a roughness map, but yet I still have all this nice detail. You can see more rough in the cracks, all this kind of stuff. All the kind of cavity areas are going to have more rough, where all is the kind of areas like here on these rocks, these kind of peak areas and all the rocks are going to be more smooth and so on. And then from here, I just start layering in different grunge maps to produce, you know, more rich kind of microsurface detail. And then, you know, throw that here into my base material. Also, what's nice about using this histogram range is just simply changing the position I'm altering a global kind of set here for my, my overall kind of roughness control. So for example, if we just add this guy in, let's come down to our roughness. We get our input. Let's plug this in. So here's kind of what we're getting. And then if we wanted to have it to where this is kind of more of a wet surface, it's just a matter of just dropping down this single position slider. Now we get like maybe it's kind of rained in this area. So we get this. If we need to rough it up, just a single pull of this slider. Now we have it roughed up, but it's roughed with variation. So kind of the smoother areas of our rock are going to be, well, more smooth through the roughness map versus some of these occluded areas where like dirt and grime and things like cracks and damage are going to, make the surface more rough. So here's kind of the result of what we're getting here. Like this rock here is starting to turn out not too bad. And you can see it's kind of just blending in here with this height and so on. All right, so it's right at 3:01, so we'll conclude this month's webinar here at this stage. Really, the whole focus of it, we didn't talk about color or anything, but I really wasn't too, I didn't really want to jump into that too much just yet. We really wanted to focus on being able to use, create some of these 3D shapes using what we're doing here with like our new flood nodes here. So again, it's always coming down to creating the flood. We can produce random colors. Again, if you just look, you can do a lot of things. You can produce gradients. You can produce position maps from this, random colors, and random grayscale, which can be used in all kinds of different ways. Here we showed how we could use it to build up 3D shapes, or use some type of grayscale for offsetting things with directional warp, or using random color to feed that into a vector warp, again, to offset patterns and shapes. So thanks a lot, everybody, for your time. Greatly appreciate it. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me directly. I'd be happy to answer any questions. Also, if you send an email to either myself or Charles and just let us know if there's any new kind of specific type workflows you guys want to see for the next webinar, we'd always love to hear your input on that. Charles will be sending out a recap email, and of course, I will attach with it this SBS so that you guys have full access to the source file, everything we covered today. So thanks a lot, everybody. Enjoy your weekend and have a nice Halloween holiday tomorrow. Take care.